Release and deployment management is a natural follow-on from change management. You could argue the two are different aspects of the same thing. The change is assessed, and assuming it's approved, it then has to be released. You can't release it until the change has been approved. Nonetheless, they're two separate processes. And release and deployment management is the process that is acting ultimately as the gatekeeper of the live environment. It's the final stage in transition that we make to make sure everything's in place before we release the service to go live, or indeed before we retire it. This is based on a release policy, and what we're trying to manage with release and deployment and change and indeed transition, which we do typically through these policies, is to create the right balance between, from a service provider's perspective, we want to maintain stability, but from the customer's perspective, they want flexibility. And so our challenge as a service provider is to agree with our customers the right balance between stability and flexibility. So there is a statistic that I must have heard 30 odd years ago again that says 70% of incidents are caused by poorly controlled change. So by managing change more effectively and implicitly the release of that change, we can reduce the number of change-related incidents. So the way we deal with this is, as a service provider, we'd like to make one change a year. There's no way the business is going to allow that to happen. They want changes for competitive advantage, they want functional changes, they want changes associated with regulation and governance, and so they'd like perhaps change every day. The challenge is, the more often the change is made, maybe the smaller it is, but the more chance there is of unforeseen side effects of making continual changes day by day without being able to test them together. And so one of the key aspects of the release policy is the release schedule. And every service, every application should have a release schedule associated with it that represents the period at which we agree with the business is appropriate to maintain that right balance between stability and flexibility. And that's why, for instance, typically at critical business periods, we have a change freeze. So if it's in retailing, the change freeze is typically in November prior to the Christmas peak, or even the sales peak in January. In universities, the change freeze will apply in August because that's when we go through clearing and the new student intake. And the whole point of a change freeze is to stop things being changed that might impact on the live environment. We now come on to our first operational process, incident management. Again, one of the four major processes. Now, incident management is unique in that it's the only process that's entirely reactive. The trigger for incident management is an incident, so it's occurred. We can't stop it occurring. Well, hopefully we can, but that's the role of problem management. So incident management has two objectives. One is to restore the service as quickly as possible, and two is to minimise the impact on the business operations. Normal service, as you can see, defined as within service levels. Now, typically, the way we do that is to apply what we call a workaround. Now, the workaround, as I mentioned earlier, might be turn it off and turn it on. And there's a classic Dilbert cartoon about this, if you know Dilbert. Dilbert's a cartoon character, and he's sitting at a service desk, and a call comes in saying, "I've got an incident." And Dilbert says, "Have you tried turning it off and turning it on again?" To which the user says, "No, I haven't." To which Dilbert says, "Try that." "Did it work?" The user says, "Yes." Dilbert says, "Fantastic, my clear-up rate is improving rapidly." Now think about this. Do we know what caused the incident in the first place? No. Will it recur? Quite probably. That's incident management. It doesn't stop it occurring again, it simply manages the impact, typically by applying a workaround, in this case turn it off and turn it on. The definition of an incident, as you can see on the slide, contains maybe more elements than you might think. Clearly, as it says, it's an unplanned interruption to a service or whatever's being delivered, and I think everyone would recognise that as an incident, but it's also a reduction in quality. So for instance, if transaction response time slowed up from half a second to 0.7 of a second, that should be considered an incident. What's probably happened in that situation is that a network line has gone down and the transmission has reconfigured and gone through an alternative route that's causing traffic build-up and queues to slow the service down. So again, that should be treated as an incident. The other part of the definition is failure of a configuration item that's not yet affected a service. And the reason that should be considered as an incident is because, of course, it could affect a service. It's the small element of incident management that could be considered proactive. And an example of that would be if last night's backup didn't complete or only partially completed, regardless of the fact that the service comes up again this morning and the users can engage with the service and it's exactly as normal, should a need arise to restore the service from that backup and that backup didn't complete, then the ability to do so would be impaired. And that's why that circumstance should be treated as an incident as well. Basic concepts in incident management. We've again got this concept of a model, in this case an incident model, which is, as I said about a change model, simply a procedure for handling a certain type of incident. So in the event that we get the blue screen of death, Alt Control Delete, go into Task Manager, close down tasks or reboot might be the procedure to follow. ITIL references major incidents, and although it doesn't tell us what a major incident is, it requires us to have a separate procedure. Major incidents are typically incidents with highest priority, or they might be high impact but low urgency. And typically the procedure for managing major incidents is immediate escalation. That escalation can be at one of two levels, either or both of two levels. We can escalate from first line to second line, which is functional escalation, and escalates to the next level of expertise. And or we can escalate to the next level of management, which is described as hierarchical escalation. And the recommendation for a major incident is you do both. One of the reasons for this is because if you imagine you're a business relationship manager having a regular meeting with a senior stakeholder, and that senior stakeholder says to you, so what is IT doing about this major incident then? What you don't want to have to say is, what major incident would that be? You want to know before they do. And that's why escalation is quite important. We mentioned earlier, but it's worth repeating, we categorise incidents, which essentially relates the incident to the cause. So it might be a network incident, it might be a hardware incident, and typically categorisation is at multiple levels. Again, ITIL is not prescriptive, and this would be covered by your incident management policy. But for instance, the first level categorisation might be hardware, the second level categorisation might be hardware server, and the third level categorisation might be hardware server disk. To indicate the potential source of the incident, to assure that it's assigned to the right resolver group if the service desk can't resolve it, and also to provide trend information to problem management. And then again, as we mentioned earlier, every incident should be prioritised because we don't have infinite resources. That priority should be based on impact and urgency. And the last concept on the screen, workarounds, is what's typically provided by problem management in order to restore the service without necessarily knowing what caused the incident. Our next process is also our next major process, problem management. And unlike incident management, this has both reactive and proactive aspects to it. And the most important one is the proactive aspect. The purpose is to ideally prevent incidents and problems from occurring, to eliminate recurring incidents, and where we can't eliminate an incident, to minimise the impact, typically by providing a workaround. It is worth mentioning though, there's a strong demarcation line between incident management and problem management. Incident management fixes and restores service, fixes the incident, restores the service, but doesn't attempt to do root cause analysis. Problem management attempts to do the root cause analysis, but does nothing to restore service beyond providing the incident teams with the workaround. The definition of a problem, as you can see, is probably one of the simplest definitions in ITIL, the cause of one or more incidents. Let's explore that for a moment. So let's assume that the room you're in suddenly loses power. The air conditioning turns off, the lights go off, the computer goes off, the projector goes off. The incident is the loss of power. The root cause of that incident might be, if you look out the window, a workman's dug through a cable. And you could say the root cause of the power failure was a workman dug through the cable. But ideally you go a little bit further and say the reason the workman having dug through the cable interrupted the power is because the building's dependent on a single power supply. And that we could protect against that either by having dual power supplies from separate subsystems, for instance as hospitals do, or having a UPS, having a battery backup and a generator on site, such that if we lost mains power, we could recover power and potentially without even any loss of power. So the root cause of the power loss might be that we don't have dual power supplies or a UPS on site. Proactive problem management is all about understanding what could go wrong and trying to prevent it going wrong. And I'll share with you that ITIL considers proactive problem management to be based on trend analysis. And when you dig a little bit deeper and look at what we're trending, it's typically minor incidents to see if there's correlation. Now, arguably, those minor incidents might be minor, but they've still occurred. So how is this proactive? And interestingly, there's an organisation I've worked with that gave me a perfect example of genuine proactive problem management. This is an organisation that's in the business of energy data. They collect energy data on energy reserves, energy production, energy sales, energy distribution, etc., etc. And they said they had heard about various companies being hacked and said, if this happened to us, this would severely impact our business, if not put us out of business, because our business is data, and if our data was hacked, we potentially don't have a business. And so what they did to deal with that potential situation is they held what they called a pre-post major incident review. In other words, they convened a major incident review to discuss an incident that hadn't happened and what they would do in response, and ultimately what they do to protect against it. And I would argue that's genuine proactive problem management, where, for instance, you're working with organisational teams like the risk management team, the continuity team, the capacity and availability team to say what could impact our services, what could go down, where are single points of failure, and how can we prevent those. And so true proactive problem management is maybe more than ITIL suggests. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that ITIL covers key building blocks like processes, functions and roles. We've spent most of the time talking about processes, and that's not unreasonable because within ITIL we've talked about 5 life cycle stages, 26 processes, 4 functions and a few roles. So you can see where the balance of power lies. ITIL is primarily a process framework. However, ITIL recognises, as we can see on the slide, 4 functions. The first of these, pretty universal, the service desk, although some organisations, and in America they still call it a help desk, but the service desk is a function as we described earlier. Bear in mind again, a function is a self-contained unit of organisation. It's a group of people, a team or possibly an individual. The other 3 functions that ITIL describes includes technical management, which is the management of the technical environment, which is mainly infrastructure, networks, etc. But there's a little bit of overlap potentially with application management, hence the blue background, because application management manages the applications. It's debatable whether things like databases, middleware, internet falls into technical management or application management. And frankly, ITIL doesn't lose sleep over that because ultimately it's up to you. In the middle, if you like, we've got operations management, IT operations management, that's broken down into 2. There's no compound name for those, there's no collective noun. They're the 2 component parts of operations management. And those are operations control and facilities management. Now, we don't often see operations control anymore because it's mainly the functions that are automated, the activities that are now no longer done by individuals. Console management, I can't remember the last time I saw someone sitting at a console releasing jobs. Job scheduling, backup and restore, mostly automated. Print and output still done, might be outsourced. Facilities management, I've always kind of amusingly referred to facilities management as the management of the physical facilities. You can remember it because they both begin with F, haha. But it's the management of the data centre, the server room, the physical environment that includes the physical access, the temperature and humidity control systems, the fire alarm and fire suppression systems. And that's operations management. Now, in practice, of course, we've got many more functions. As you saw on my diagram of the organisational structure, we've got the desktop support team, the server team, the network management team. And the reason ITIL's a little bit thin on this is because different organisations can call those teams different names where they actually represent the same function, or they can have the same name for something that represents a different function. And there's much more flexibility there than we have in the process world. So ITIL's kind of paying lip service to functions and recognising just these four. So the one I'm going to focus on is the service desk. It's a critical function. The reason for that is because it is the single point of contact for day-to-day interactions with users and customers, and therefore it absolutely has the potential to impact customer satisfaction and their perception of IT. In fact, I think it's fair to say that many business users see IT as the service desk. It's their main interaction with IT beyond the screen they're looking at, and therefore the effectiveness of the service desk is in effect a measure of the effectiveness of IT. The pity of this in many organisations is that the service desk is staffed by typically the most junior, the lowest paid, the most stressed, and the people with the shortest length of service, which is not the best people necessarily, or not the best environment for delivering customer service. But I feel that it's unfortunate that many organisations undervalue this function, which is sometimes why they outsource it. In practice, the service desk is the eyes and ears of the organisation. And I mean they manage communication both ways. The reason ITIL now refers to it as a service desk as opposed to a help desk is because we're no longer just receiving information or managing incidents. We're taking service requests, we're giving out information, we're providing support. We're in effect giving some training sometimes on how to do things. And so it's much more than just a help desk. Colloquially, the service desk is known as first line support, and that's because it should be the first point of contact. And more ability you can put into that function to handle any interaction with the customers, the better. So empowering the service desk, giving them information, allowing them to be able to reset passwords, to set up new user IDs, to order consumables, to book training courses, etc. The more effective it is, the more it'll get used. So there's at least three ways you can structure a service desk, and ITIL says there's these three distinct ways. You can have a local service desk, which by implication means more than one local desk, where the desk is co-located with the users it supports. So implicitly you've got more than one location. Each location has its own service desk. Perfectly valid structure. There's some pluses and minuses of this. The pluses, obviously, having a local environment gives a faster response time, better local knowledge, people get to know each other. The downside is you've probably got more cost having local service desks. It's harder to keep them aligned. You might be solving something in more than one place that has a common root cause that you wouldn't spot. And so what we see as a more common structure of service desks is a centralised service desk. And by implication, a centralised service desk is a single physical desk that may or may not be co-located with its main user group, or it could be somewhere entirely separate, but there is only one physical desk. The advantage is that you've got only one body of knowledge, they work together, they can solve hopefully everything that comes at them. The disadvantage, they don't necessarily have local expertise, but it is going to be cheaper to run. But then on the other hand, there's no backup. If that service desk becomes unoccupiable, how do you maintain the service? And so the third structure that ITIL recognises of a service desk is called a virtual service desk. And a virtual service desk comprises more than one physical desks that are operating as a single virtual desk. In other words, the caller or the user rings one number. Which actual physical desk they get, they don't care about, and the call will be routed to one or the other. As an example, one of the airlines has a service desk at Heathrow and another one at Newcastle. You know which you've got from the accent, but you've only dialed one number, and either of them can help you. And that structure tends to create the best of both the local and the centralised structures. And a version of the virtual service desk is the Follow the Sun service desk, as it's known. The reason it's called Follow the Sun is because if you're a large international organisation, you could have 3 service desks in each of the time zones, or one in each of the time zones. So typically there'd be one in the Far East or Australia, one in Europe or UK, and one in North America. Consequently, as the sun rises, the service desk comes on stream, is open for daytime only, and then hands over to the next desk where the sun's about to come up there. The advantage is that you don't have to run a shift system in any one location. You don't need overnight. The disadvantage is the incidents don't tend to come and go within that time zone, so they have to be managed across the 3 service desks. But it's not an uncommon structure to use. I'm going to conclude now with the continual service improvement lifecycle stage. It's a whole lifecycle stage. If you remember, it's a wrapper around the rest of the lifecycle, so that anything at any time is capable of improvement and should be looked at for improvement. There is one process within it which we'll look at, the 7-step improvement process. But the key characteristics of CSI, firstly, we're looking to improve both efficiency and effectiveness in the way I mentioned at the beginning of this overview. Not just beneficial for the service provider, but also beneficial for the customer, and not one at the exclusion of the other. CSI should also look at all aspects of IT, from, as we said, strategy right through to operation and so on. It should be both reactive and proactive. Reactively, it might be responding to complaints from users, it might be responding to missed service levels. Proactively, it's saying, how can we help users make more effective use of this service? And our ability to do a lot of this is underpinned by measurement. And so CSI is absolutely interested in all the measurement aspects of IT as an indicator of how effective IT is and how it can be improved. The focal point for CSI is IT and business alignment, and how that needs to be maintained as the business environment and indeed the IT environment changes over time. So CSI's focus is not only on improvement, but also business and IT alignment over time. So what we're looking at doing is understanding how effective we are monitoring what we're able to achieve, using those measures, not just of the activities, but also process maturity itself, the outcomes. Customer satisfaction and perception will be another variable, all of which we're looking to recognise, analyse and use as the basis for understanding improvement. One key thing to think about in terms of CSI is this is another activity, a life cycle stage, that operates on the horizontal dimension, remember, that aligns to processes and services rather than the technical dimension. And there's potentially some overlap. So one of the things CSI says is we should ensure that all processes have policies. Well, that's the very specific accountability of the process owner. But CSI is there to make sure those building blocks are in place. CSI spans the technology and says, is it working effectively to help us deliver services and ultimately value to the business? And so the CSI activities should be relatively high level and span the whole of IT. Now, I mentioned that we've only got one process in CSI, and it's the 7-step improvement process. So let me explain. This is a 3-dimensional process. There's 3 elements to this process. The first is the 7 steps, and the first step says, what's the vision? So we need to understand what our vision is, what our mission, our objectives, our KPIs are, to understand what we're trying to achieve. That's the, if you like, the start point of looking to see what potential there is for improvement is describing the end goal. Now that definition of the vision and the objectives helps us understand what we need to measure to be able to demonstrate whether we're achieving the vision. And classically, the interface is we define a vision for the organisation, so we want to be the best, whatever it is, information provider, the best finance provider, the best local government organisation. In order to achieve that vision, there's certain critical success factors. We need our offices in certain locations. We need key skills. We need a certain amount of money. And the way we measure the achievement of those critical success factors is with key performance indicators. So that first stage helps us define what needs to be measured to demonstrate whether or not we're achieving our vision. The risk is if you don't do that visioning stage that gets you to the KPI, you measure, or you tend to measure what you can measure rather than what you should measure. So step 2 is defining what needs to be measured. Step 3 then is collecting data about those measures. Now at this stage, that's just data, it's just numbers. And the way we move numbers from being data to information is we apply context and understanding. If I give you an example, last week we had 300 calls to the service desk. That's a number, 300. It doesn't tell us anything. If we plotted the arrival rate of those calls and learnt that Monday's the busiest day, and particularly between 10 and 11, and Thursday's the quietest day, that's information. We've plotted the distribution rate of those calls and found a difference. It still doesn't help us make decisions though. And so to turn information into knowledge, we have to look at what that distribution is telling us. And when we learn that the peak of calls on Monday morning is due to two things typically, one is the backlog of calls over the weekend when we didn't provide a full support service. The second is password resets for people who had their password reset on Friday and haven't used it since. That's knowledge, and with that knowledge we can make decisions. So this 7-step process, having collected data, we now start to process and analyse that data in order to be able to move us from being data to information to be knowledge. And with the benefit of knowledge, we can then propose an intervention or a change with a degree of confidence that it's going to be beneficial. And so the 7th step is to introduce the improvement. Now, a couple of other things to mention. That's a cycle and it's repeated, but it's not repeated without a pause. So once we've introduced the improvement or the planned improvement, we then pause and step back and evaluate the improvement effect. And if it's positive, we embed it into business as usual. And the reason why we call it oddly continual service improvement rather than continuous service improvement is to reflect that fact that we go through that cycle once, pause, reflect, if it's beneficial, embed it into business as usual, and then plan and deploy the next improvement. Continual rather than continuous. The third dimension to this model is that it's based on the Deming cycle, which exists outside ITIL, and is based on a simple 4-step approach to improvement that says the start point is to plan what we're going to do, then we start collecting information to support that planning, which we then analyse, which is the checking bit, before we deploy the intervention, which is the act bit. And so it's based on that simple concept that Deming introduced many years ago to manufacturing, and in this case applied to a service industry. I want to end with 2 slides. The first says what not to do, the second says what to do, the rights and the wrongs, or the wrongs and the rights. And this is based on a degree of personal experience and working with other organisations. This may sound simple, but treat ITIL as an adoption rather than an implementation. Don't treat it as a project. The risk of treating it as a project is that people think it's something that's going to have an end point, and that maybe they can keep their heads down and next month there'll be a different improvement initiative. This is, as I mentioned earlier, a cultural change. It's a different way of working. And so treating it as a project or an implementation is probably not the most effective way of doing it. The second mistake to make, and we hinted at this when we looked at process maturity, is to establish maturity levels or target maturity levels too high. You have to recognise that to take the ITIL framework and adopt it into an organisation that hasn't previously adopted it, it is likely to take years, at least 3 years. And it's going to take you that time to get a process to level 2 or 3. It absolutely isn't necessary to get it beyond level 3 at that stage. Walk before you run. Another mistake to make is to start from scratch, colloquially throwing out the baby with the bathwater. It's very likely that a lot of what you're doing is entirely appropriate and might even be ITIL aligned. So the first step would be to sanity check what you're doing and then look at where there's improvements to be made, but don't assume it's starting from scratch. Another easy mistake to make is to think that you can adopt ITIL by simply adopting an ITIL tool. There's many tools on the market, some are better than others, but we should all know by now that the tool is never the solution. The tool should be part of the solution. A bad tool can impact negatively the solution, a good tool can support the solution. But the classic saying, a fool with a tool is still a fool, absolutely applies. Another classic mistake to think is that ITIL itself is going to provide a total solution. There's lots of organisations who've attempted to implement or adopt ITIL and not made it work because they haven't dealt with all the aspects of training, education, policies, procedures that all need to be built around this to make it work. And so simply having a service management framework in itself, whilst a major step forward, is not the only thing that needs doing. And the challenge when you're taking on ITIL, and implicitly effort and cost, is that it's almost impossible to establish a numeric relationship between process maturity and operational performance. I can't say to you that if you get your change process from maturity level 2 to maturity level 3, you're going to suffer 10% fewer change-related incidents. We know intuitively there's a link, but it's not easy to establish that link in hard numbers. And the reason for that is because change-related incidents are affected by other things than just the change. They're affected by the age of the infrastructure, the number of people we've got managing the infrastructure, etc., etc. So it can be quite challenging to try and justify adopting ITIL and improving maturity. Don't try and do it through purely numeric relationships. So our final slide is how to do it right. And when we talk about ITIL, we naturally talk about processes. Essentially, the 26 ITIL processes cover pretty much the management of IT, with one or two obvious exceptions. It doesn't cover project management, and the reason for that is because Prince 2 fills in the gaps that ITIL does, so ITIL felt it inappropriate to duplicate that. But apart from the project work, those 26 processes represent what needs to be done to manage IT effectively. And remember, the key to having a process under control and mature is to have a process owner. Those process owners become your champions. Those champions should live and breathe the process, evangelise it, promote it, and when you've got that in place, you will gain traction, you will get momentum behind process maturity. Having management commitment is an obvious thing to say, but it's absolutely true in ITIL as it would be in any other walk of life. If management appear to be paying lip service to it or aren't appearing to be committed to it, then how can they expect other people to be so? The ITIL practices and the guidance apply in every supplier scenario. This means whether you're totally insourced, fully outsourced, or part and part. The guidance is supplier agnostic, if you like. So whatever operating model you have, ITIL is entirely appropriate. We mentioned right at the beginning that communication is a key concept in ITIL. It's also the thing that technologists are often weakest at. And so it's vital that we maintain communication lines, that we get buy-in from the business, and that we don't treat this just as an IT activity. We mentioned also that the ability to improve is underpinned by measurement, and that therefore it's important to have the right measures at the right time, to understand them, to interpret them, to analyse them, and to understand what they're telling us about how well we're doing and how much potential there is to improve. And ultimately, none of this will work unless we get the buy-in of staff. The staff are the ones who, if you like, are the glue that makes all this work. You have to recognise your role in this, you have to be appropriately trained and skilled, and provide an effective contribution. That might be as a service owner or a process owner, a process manager. Whatever your role is, you now begin to see the role that you play in the bigger picture of ultimately delivering services and value from IT to the business. Thank you.